This wooden airplane was supposed to be the laughingstock of all Europe, but instead, it became the chief executioner of the British Navy. Today, I will tell you about the Savoia-Marchetti SM.79 Sparviero, the legendary Italian bomber nicknamed the Hunchback. It was built for triumph at prestigious air races, but it failed to start miserably and was publicly branded an absolute loser. But how did this civilian contraption, made of steel tubes and plywood, suddenly mutate into the most effective torpedo bomber of the Second World War? What dirty secret did its strange silhouette hide? And how did a machine lacking even basic internal communication between its crew members manage to survive where state-of-the-art fighters were burning in droves? The finale of this story will surprise you, I promise. The year is 1934, London. At the starting line of one of the most prestigious air races of the decade. The route? London to Melbourne. 20,000 kilometers over oceans and continents. This is not just a competition, it is a showcase of national technology. Every country wants to prove that its engineers are the best in the world. Among the contenders is Italian designer Alessandro Marchetti. Behind him is a company with a long official name, Società Idrovolanti Alta Italia. Translated, it means roughly High Italy Seaplane Society. But the whole world knows it simply as Savoia. At that point, Savoia had been building flying boats for 15 years, and they built them well. The S-16 and S-62 series were purchased by the Soviet Air Force. In the Far East, the massive twin-hulled S-55 series remained in service until nearly the 40s. The reputation was impeccable. But Marchetti wants more. For the race, he builds a completely new machine. He bases it on the SM-73 passenger plane, built in that same year of 1934. A fuselage of steel tubes, a wooden wing, skin made of duralumin, plywood, and fabric. Streamlined forms. And for the first time in Italy on a multi-engine aircraft, retractable landing gear. The engines are liquid-cooled inline models from the Isotta Fraschini firm. 3 engines, 3 propellers. On October 8, 1934, the prototype with the registration E Mago makes its first flight. Marchetti is pleased. The machine flies. But he had already lost the race before even taking off. The English de Havilland DH-88 Comet won. The Italian machine simply didn't make it in time. Years of work, a new design, an ambitious concept, and no result in the official protocol. Or was there a result after all? Test pilot Adriano Bacula flies the machine and writes in his report, short and clear. Flight characteristics are high, handling is good, and speed data is promising. But there is a problem. The Isotta Fraschini engines are unreliable. They fail. In the air. During tests. Again and again. Imagine having an ideal car body. Beautiful, sturdy, aerodynamic. But the engine stalls right on the highway, time after time. That is exactly what was happening. In the spring of 1935, the engines were changed. They installed radial Alfa Romeo 125 RC.35 series engines, 680 horsepower each. It was an improved variant of the British Bristol Pegasus engine, a reliable, proven model well known in Europe. At the same time, the narrow engine cowlings were replaced with wider ones for better cooling. On April 5, 1935, the upgraded machine takes to the air. The speed on the first flight is 355 kilometers per hour. Later, during refinement, 410. For a multi-engine plane of 1935, this is an outstanding result. The machine receives the designation SM.79-P. The letter P stands for passenger. For now, passenger. The official tests at the Guidonia Center near Rome are passed. A certificate of airworthiness is obtained, and the military pilots working at Guidonia have already managed to get to know this plane personally. One of them is not just a pilot. He is the Chief of Staff of the Italian Royal Air Force, General Giuseppe Valle. And he looks at this machine not at all the way the designer does. He sees something else in it, and he already has a plan. Summer 1935, Africa. In these months, on the shores of the Red Sea, in the Italian colony of Eritrea, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers are concentrated. Chief of Staff of the Royal Air Force, General Giuseppe Valle, must personally visit, or rather, fly over, all the bases. The route is long. The plane needs to be fast and reliable. Valle chooses the SM-79. For this flight, the machine is thoroughly prepared. Additional fuel tanks are installed in the rear parts of the engine nacelles to ensure enough range for the long stretches over the sea and desert. The instrument panel is supplemented. The plane receives the military number MM-260. On August 1st, the general departs from Rome. 12 hours, and he is in Massawa, the main port of Eritrea. Then, 4 days of flying from base to base. Heat, dust, hot air over scorched airfields, and every time, the same machine that works. Precisely. Without surprises. Valle returns to Rome a convinced supporter of the SM-79. Now, a parallel story that was unfolding at the same time. In 1934, the Italian Air Force announced an official competition for a new medium bomber. The requirements were clearly spelled out. The plane must be twin-engine. 2 engines allowed for easier accommodation of the crew, a simpler arrangement for defensive armament, and better visibility forward for the navigator. 8 companies submitted proposals. Among the projects were serious machines: the Fiat BR-20, Caproni C A135, and Piaggio P32. All twin-engine, all by the rules. The Savoia company also tried. It proposed the SM-79B variant, a conversion of the racing plane into a bomber with 2 French Gnome-Rhone K-14 engines. Fast, without deep modification of the design. The commission studied the project and rejected it. The reason? Poor placement of bombs and small arms. Simply put, there was nowhere proper to hang the bombs, and it was inconvenient for the gunners to work. The competition went on. And then Valle intervened. He did not wait for the results. He made the decision himself. The general signed an order for 24 3-engine bombers based on the SM-79. The designation? SM-79-K. The letter K appeared because it was originally planned to install French Gnome-Rhone K-14 engines. They would later be abandoned, but the designation remained. Wait, 24 planes, 3-engine ones, while the official competition required twin-engine ones. How was that possible? Valle was chief of staff. He had the authority. And he had arguments, weighty ones. The mixed construction of the SM-79, steel, wood, plywood, fabric, is not archaic. It is a calculation. Italian aircraft factories in the mid-30s lagged behind those of the United States, Great Britain, and Germany in equipment. They had less skilled workers. They had less modern equipment. To produce all-metal planes in large quantities would mean hitting this ceiling very quickly. But an SM-79 can be built in such a factory. It is a simple machine to manufacture. And many machines are needed. 24 is just the beginning. The only existing SM-79P, meanwhile, is equipped with bomb racks and sent to the range in Sparviero to be tested as a bomber. The tests are successful. So, a racing plane prototype, having lost its only race, is officially transformed into a military bomber. By the personal order of one general, bypassing the competition. Now the engineers need to translate this order into reality, to turn a fast, graceful plane into a machine that carries bombs, defends itself, and brings the crew home. This turned out to be a difficult task. July 8, 1936. It was on this day that the first real bomber variant of the SM-79 took to the air. Not a prototype, not a conversion, not a test machine, but a serial combat aircraft. Let's break it down piece by piece, because the design explains everything that will happen later. Let's start with what catches the eye first. Above the pilot's cabin is a characteristic protrusion, a rounded hump that stretches from the cabin almost to the middle of the fuselage. It was this that gave the plane the unofficial nickname that stuck to it forever. In official documents, the machine was called Sparviero, Sparrowhawk. In the units, it was called simply Gobbo. In Italian, that means Hunchback. In the hump are 2 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns. One faces forward and is fixed. The pilot operates it. The second faces backward and is installed on a movable turret for protection against attacks from the rear. Designer Marchetti reasoned as follows. The plane flies fast. Attacking it head-on on intercept courses is extremely difficult. Therefore, heavy frontal defense is not that critical. The logic is understandable, but, as the war will show, it is not indisputable. The fuselage is wide and boxy, a legacy of the passenger machine. A frame of steel tubes on the outside, skin of duralumin sheets in the front, plywood and fabric in the tail section. The wing is wooden, cantilevered, transferred almost unchanged from the passenger SM-73. Three-bladed variable pitch propellers. Three 750 horsepower Alfa Romeo 126 RC34 series engines. One in the nose, two on the wing. Total power, 2,250 horsepower. For 1936, very respectable. Now about where the bombs are placed. The central part of the fuselage is a bomb bay. It is slightly shifted to the right of the longitudinal axis of the plane. This was done intentionally. A narrow passage was left on the left for the crew to move to the tail section. The bomb bay holds up to 1,200 kilograms of bombs. The loading variants are different. 2 500-kilogram bombs, or 5 250-kilogram bombs, or 12 100-kilogram bombs. One can also load 12 cassettes with small 12-kilogram fragmentation bombs. All bombs are hung vertically, except for the 500-kilogram ones, which are angled. Now, where the person who drops all this sits. Here is where the first compromise begins. In a classic bomber, the navigator bombardier sits in the nose of the plane behind glass and sees everything ahead. But in the nose of the SM-79, there is an engine. Putting a person there is impossible. They found this way out. Under the fuselage, in the tail section, they made a special hanging gondola, glazed, elongated, with a transparent front wall. The bombardier lies in it and looks down and forward. At his disposal is a Jaws Model U-3 bomb sight and a drop control panel. In the tail part of the gondola is another 12.7mm machine gun directed backward. The crew consists of 4 people: 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and a radio operator. The second pilot also serves as the bombardier. One more machine gun is above the gondola, inside the fuselage. Caliber 7.69mm. Fires through rectangular side hatches. The mount can be moved from side to side. On paper, it looks sufficient. But now, about what was not written in the advertising brochures. The SM-79 did not have an internal communication system between crew members. None at all. The pilot could not transmit a signal to the bombardier. The bombardier could not answer the pilot. In the noise of 3 engines on the combat course, total silence between people who should work as a single mechanism. This led to delays in bomb dropping. And a delay in bombing is a miss. Every time. There was also no automatic flight stabilization system on the combat course. Such systems were already present on more modern bombers of other countries by the mid-30s. On the SM-79, the pilot held the course manually. And one more thing. There was no oxygen equipment for working at high altitudes on the machine. This meant a practical combat ceiling, no higher than 4.5 to 5,000 meters in combat conditions. So what do we have in October 1936, when the first serial machines start arriving in the units? Fast, yes. Beautiful by the standards of its time, yes. Capable of carrying a decent bomb load? Yes. With internal communication between the crew? No. With a stabilization system? No. With protection at high altitudes? No. The machine was what it was, with all its compromises. And it was precisely with such a machine that Italian crews would very soon embark on their first real war. October 1936. On the Iberian Peninsula, a civil conflict is underway. Spain is split. And very quickly this country will turn into a proving ground for the aviation of all Europe. Italian crews on SM-79s appeared there almost immediately. Officially, volunteers. In fact, professional military pilots with a combat mission. They were based in the south of the country and worked throughout the peninsula, near Seville, near Bilbao, in the Brunette area, near Teruel. The routes are long. The targets are different. There is no experience, because experience only appears here, in real sorties. And it was here that the main practical advantage of the Hunchback became clear. The SM-79 flew fast, very fast by the standards of 1936 to 1937, 410 to 430 kilometers per hour at working altitude. Of all the Republican aviation, only one type of fighter could consistently catch and intercept it, the Soviet Polikarpov 116. Compact, mean, with a powerful engine. But there were few 116s, and they could not be everywhere at once. The other Republican fighters simply could not keep up with the Hunchback. This meant the SM-79 could fly during the day without fighter cover, all by itself, and return. There were losses, but relatively small ones. Throughout the entire civil conflict in Spain, Italian crews lost 12 machines. Spanish pilots on the side of Franco, who also flew these planes, lost 4. For intense combat operations over almost 3 years, that is little. The survivability of the machine proved higher than assumed on paper. In May 1937, an episode occurred that made people talk about the Hunchback on a different level. A group of 5 SM-79s attacked the Republican battleship Jaime I in the port of Almeria. A battleship is not a transport ship or a patrol boat. It is a warship with a displacement of over 15,000 tons, with armor protection and anti-aircraft artillery. Attacking it with horizontal bombing is an extremely difficult task. Hitting a moving or even stationary ship with a bomb from an altitude of several thousand meters is not the same as hitting an airfield or a building. All 5 returned to base. The battleship was damaged. This was a signal. Not a victory and not a catastrophe, but a signal. The machine works where it was not expected to. From January 1938, the SM-79 began to be used at night. Night sorties are a completely different story. No landmarks. Navigation only by instruments and stars. Targets on the ground are almost invisible. But that was exactly what gave the advantage. You are also not visible. Intercepting a night bomber without radar is a task almost impossible to perform. The first to personally show the example was General Valle himself. He took off from a base on the Italian mainland and bombed Barcelona at night. After him, regular night sorties from the island of Majorca were started by the 8th Wing of the Italian Expeditionary Forces. A whole wing working at night over a foreign country on planes that 3 years ago were racing prototypes. In February 1938, a lone SM-79 at night found and destroyed a large power plant in the city of Serra. One plane, one target, a precise strike in the dark. For 1938, this was a very high level of night mission accuracy. When the civil conflict ended in 1939, the surviving 61 SM-79s of the Italian Expeditionary Corps were handed over to the Spanish Air Force. These machines would survive the entire Second World War and continue to fly in Spanish colonies in North Africa, Ifni, and Rio de Oro right up until the beginning of the 60s. But more on that later. Spain gave answers to the main questions. Speed works as protection. Survivability is good. At night, they are applicable. Crews accumulate experience. While some hunchbacks were fighting, others were doing something completely different at the same time. They were chasing records. And that was also part of a grand plan. While battles were raging in Spain, a completely different story was unfolding in Italy. The same machine, a different life. And these 2 lives went in parallel, never crossing. July 1936. On one of the units of the second series, the engines are changed. Instead of standard Alfa Romeo ones, they install 9-cylinder radial Piaggio P11 RC40 engines. The power is 1,000 horsepower each, versus 750 for standard motors. The difference is significant. From July to November 1936, this plane sets a series of world speed records. The categories: planes with a payload of 500 kilograms, 1,000 kilograms, and 2,000 kilograms. All 3 records, by one machine, by one crew, over several months. Think about this for a second. The plane carries a load the weight of 2 small cars, and sets a speed record while doing so. This is about like a truck with a full bed overtaking a sports car without passengers on the highway. The International Aeronautical Federation registers the results. They are published. Newspapers in Europe and America write about them. The Italian aviation industry ends up on the front pages. Parallel to this, long-range flights. A group of SM-79s completes the Rome to Brazil to Rome route. Then, a flight through Damascus. Each such route is a demonstration of the machine's reliability, range, and endurance before an audience that makes decisions about buying aircraft. Because Savoia wants to sell SM-79s abroad. For export, a separate variant is created, the SM.79-B. The letter B is from the word bimotore, meaning twin engine. Yes, twin engine. The export machine differs from the Italian serial variant fundamentally. Instead of 3 engines, there are 2, but more powerful ones. For different buyers, different motors. French Gnome Rhone or Hispano Suiza. The nose engine is removed, the nose of the plane is glazed, the bombardier gets normal visibility forward, as it should be. Buyers are found. Brazil orders its machines. Iraq orders its own. Then Romania and Yugoslavia follow. And here, stop for a second. Romania and Yugoslavia, 2 neighboring states. Both buy the SM-79B at roughly the same time, in the late 30s. Both receive practically identical planes. And a few years later, these 2 countries will end up on opposite sides of a major conflict. Romania on one side, Yugoslavia on the other. With identical planes, produced in the same factory, according to the same blueprints. Such things happen in aviation history not often. But let's return to Italy. Serial production is gaining momentum. In November 1936, the 12th wing near Rome receives the first machines. Gradually, other factories are connected to production. Besides the company's head factory in Sesto Calende, machines begin to be built by Reggiane and ISA. Production is distributed. This reduces risks and increases tempo. By the end of the 1930s, the SM-79 becomes the main heavy bomber of the Italian Royal Air Force. In the units, it is well known. Crews have flown hundreds of hours on it. Technicians know how to fix it quickly. Logistics are refined. On paper, everything is ready for a big war. But paper and reality are different things. June 1940 will show this with all its harshness. Because in June 1940, Italy enters the war, and the Hunchback is immediately thrown into the fight, on several directions at once, without a pause, without extra preparation. Straight from the fire into the frying pan. And it will very quickly become clear. Records and demonstration flights are one thing. Real war against a prepared enemy is something else entirely. June 10, 1940. Italy declares its entry into the war on the side of Germany against Great Britain and France. From this day, the count goes by the hour. Already the next day, June 11th, Italian bombers take off from the runways of Sicily. Course south. Target, the island of Malta. A small rocky island in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, about 300 kilometers from the shores of Sicily. A British naval base. A key point in the entire theater of military operations. 137 planes, simultaneously, on the very first day. To understand the scale, 137 planes is about 10 full-fledged air wings lifted into the air at the same time. Malta did not expect such a blow. The British garrison of the island at that moment had only a few obsolete biplanes for interception. At the same time, planes from Libya strike French bases in Tunisia. From Italy itself, strikes on Corsica and Marseille. From Ethiopia, on the British base in Aden. 4 directions, simultaneously, in the first days of the war. The Hunchback appears everywhere at once. But it is in North Africa that a story unfolds that will show the limits of this machine's capabilities. September 1940. The Italian army begins an offensive from Libya to the east, toward Egypt. 4 wings of SM-79s must support this offensive from the air. The task is to help troops on the battlefield. And here, someone makes a decision that will prove to be a serious mistake. SM-79s begin to be used as ground attack aircraft. A ground attack aircraft is a plane that flies low and hits ground targets right on the battlefield. At equipment, at infantry, at positions. This requires armor, maneuverability, and powerful offensive armament directed forward and down. A ground attack plane is created to survive under fire from the ground at low altitude. The SM-79 was not a ground attack plane. Not at all. The armor is minimal. The fuel tanks, without self-sealing, that is, without a special coating that prevents the tank from catching fire from a bullet puncture. At low altitude, over the battlefield, under the fire of British anti-aircraft guns and machine guns, this is a death sentence. Imagine a person in ordinary clothes who is asked to do the work of a combat engineer. There are tools, there is desire, but there is no protection. In roughly such a situation, the crews of the SM-79 found themselves when they were sent to hunt for British armored cars and tanks at low altitudes. Losses quickly went up. Commanders on the ground saw the result and demanded air support. Aviation commanders sent what was at hand, hunchbacks. And the hunchbacks returned with holes, or did not return at all. The practice had to be urgently curtailed, but time and machines had already been spent. By mid-December 1940, British troops launched a counteroffensive and drove the Italians back out of Egypt, swiftly, harshly, with heavy losses for the Italian side. 7 wings of SM-79s working in North Africa were bled dry. Machines were lost in battles, abandoned during retreat, left on captured airfields. When British units entered Italian field airfields, they found abandoned planes. About 30 SM-79s fell into British hands in more or less intact condition. British aviation experts did not just break them. They began to study them. They flew the captured machines. They took apart the engines, studied the glider design, looked at how the shooting points were arranged, and wrote detailed technical reports. These reports changed the British perception of the Italian aviation industry in the direction of greater respect than before. The machine turned out to be better than they thought. But the fact remained. By the beginning of 1941, the SM-79 in the role of a daylight horizontal bomber was rapidly becoming obsolete. New British fighters, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, no longer gave the Hunchback the freedom it had over Spain against the I-16. Speed was no longer absolute protection. In November 1940, the head factory in Sesto Calende stops production of the SM-79. 2 other factories, Aisa and Reggiane, continue for some time, but the direction is already clear. The Hunchback is being replaced by the more modern 3-engine bomber, the Cant Z.1007. It would seem the story is ending. The plane did its job, time to retire. But it was precisely at this moment that someone asked the right question. Not, how do we replace this plane? But, is there a role for it that we haven't thought of yet? The answer turned out to be yes. And this answer changed everything. There is a moment in the history of any technology when engineers look at an aging machine and ask themselves an inconvenient question. What if we use it not at all the way we intended from the very beginning? This is exactly what happened to the SM-79 at the turn of 1940 to 1941. And the answer to this question came from a completely unexpected place, from the Italian naval aviation. The Mediterranean Sea in 1940 is not just water between shores. It is the main artery of supply for both sides of the conflict. The British hold Malta, Gibraltar, and Alexandria. The Italians control most of the shores. Each convoy is a strategic event. To sink a British transport with equipment and fuel means to weaken the enemy in North Africa directly and immediately. Horizontal bombing of ships is an extremely difficult task. The ship moves. It maneuvers when it sees planes. Hitting with a bomb falling from an altitude of 3,000 to 4,000 meters at a target that is moving away is a matter of luck almost to the same extent as skill. Italian bombers tried. The results were modest. But there was another idea, a torpedo. An aircraft torpedo is not a bomb. It does not fall vertically down. It enters the water at a small angle, levels out, and goes horizontally under the surface toward the target. A hit below the waterline where there is no armor, exactly where the ship is truly vulnerable. But for the torpedo to correctly enter the water, the plane must drop it from a very low altitude, about 50 meters above the sea surface. This is the height of about a 5-story building, and at a speed of about 300 kilometers per hour, and at a distance of 800 to 1,000 meters from the target. That is, less than 1 kilometer from a ship that is firing at you with everything it has. Now imagine this from inside the cockpit. You fly over the sea, so low that you can see the waves in the porthole, individually. The speed, like an express train. Ahead, a warship, and it already sees you. It is already turning its guns. It is already opening fire. Tracer salvos draw lines over the water straight to you. You have a few seconds to get exactly on the combat course, maintain altitude and speed, drop the torpedo at the right moment, and clear out. It was precisely in such conditions that the crews of the SM-79 worked when the plane was converted into a torpedo bomber. For the new role, the machine was seriously overhauled. First thing, they removed the bombardier's sub-fuselage gondola. It was good for horizontal bombing from altitude, but for a torpedo attack, it was not needed at all, and only created extra aerodynamic drag. Without it, the plane became slightly faster and more maneuverable near the ground. Under the fuselage appeared torpedo suspension points. The standard torpedo, the Italian Aviation 450mm caliber. It weighs about 850 kilograms. One can be suspended in the center, or two on the sides of the fuselage. Two variants for two different tactics. The design was reinforced in the attachment points. The loads during takeoff with a torpedo and during exit from an attack at low altitude are completely different than during ordinary bombing. The crew was reduced. In the torpedo-carrying variant, there were usually 3 on board: the pilot, the second pilot, and the radio gunner. The 4th crew member in this role was excess weight. The tactics were developed by trial and error. It quickly became clear: a single attack is too dangerous. The ship concentrates all anti-aircraft fire on one plane. The chances of reaching the drop point are not high. The solution: an attack by a pair or a trio of machines from different directions simultaneously. 2 planes make runs from different sides. The anti-aircraft gunners are forced to divide their fire. One of the 2 makes it through. One does not. But the torpedo goes into the water. The pilots who specialized in these attacks received a special, unofficial nickname in the Italian Air Force. Translating it accurately is difficult, but the meaning is roughly the desperate or the reckless. They knew the statistics. They understood that every sortie for a torpedo attack is not training and not a demonstration flight. They went, again and again. Among them were pilots who performed dozens of such sorties. There were also those who did not return from the first one. The first results of using the SM-79 in the role of a torpedo bomber turned out to be encouraging. The machine was coping. It was fast enough to get away after the drop, stable enough to maintain a precise combat course at low altitude, durable enough to return with bullet holes. The concept worked, and the Italian naval aviation began to apply it systematically. The Mediterranean Sea became a new proving ground for the Hunchback. Only now, it was no longer a bomber with obsolete tactics. It was a torpedo bomber, with tactics against which the British Navy initially had no ready answer. 1941, the Mediterranean Sea. A British convoy is heading east, toward Alexandria. Several transport ships, around them, an escort of destroyers. On every ship, a watch at the anti-aircraft guns. Radio operators listen to the air. Signalers look at the sky. They know an attack is coming. They don't know when. And somewhere over the sea, 2 SM-79s are already flying. Low, almost at the water itself. At such an altitude, they are harder to notice against the background of waves, especially in the haze or at dawn. They are coming from different sides. The pilot of the left machine sees the right one out of the corner of his eye. The agreement is simple. We approach simultaneously, drop simultaneously. We leave, each on his own course. The distance to the convoy is shrinking. 5 kilometers. 3. 2. On the ships, they are noticed. They open fire. 1 kilometer. Anti-aircraft tracers stretch over the water. The plane is thrown from side to side, evasive maneuvers at a critically low altitude, when under you is not land, but sea. An error of a few meters down, and the machine goes into the water. 800 meters. Drop. The torpedo goes into the water. The plane makes a sharp turn and leaves on a low-level flight away from the convoy. Behind, the rumble of anti-aircraft guns. Ahead, the horizon. Did it hit or not? They will find out later. It was exactly like this, sortie after sortie, that the Italian crews on SM-79s worked on the Mediterranean Sea in 1941 to 1943. Systematically, methodically, with increasing losses and with increasing results. The main target, British convoys to Malta. Malta in these years was besieged. The island held out only at the expense of sea supply. Every sunk transport is missing fuel, equipment, food. Every destroyed convoy is the approach of the moment when the garrison will not be able to hold out. For the Italian naval aviation, convoys to Malta were the #1 priority target. The tactics of pair and triple attacks from different directions proved to be truly difficult to counter. Anti-aircraft artillery of a ship works effectively when there is one target. You can concentrate all the fire. When there are two targets and they are coming from different sides simultaneously, the calculations are forced to divide. Half the fire goes to the right, half to the left. The density of fire on each individual plane drops by half. The chances of reaching the drop point grow. British naval officers understood this, and in their reports, they wrote about the attacks of Italian torpedo bombers with frank professional respect. In one such report, compiled by a British destroyer commander after repelling an attack in 1942, the SM-79 attacks were described with a word that looks unexpected in a military document: elegant. Enemies, people who just fired at these planes with all their might, wrote in an official document the word elegant. This says a lot about how honed the tactics were, about how accurately the crews held the combat course under fire, about the fact that professionalism is visible even to the enemy, especially to the enemy. But professionalism did not cancel out losses. Every successful attack was given at a cost. Not always with shot-down machines. Sometimes, planes that returned to base with punctured tanks, torn rudders, wounded crew members. Sometimes, machines that sat on the water a few kilometers from the shore. Sometimes, those who simply did not make contact after moving away from the target. The loss statistics in the torpedo aviation were worse than in the ordinary bombing one. Everyone knew about it. The crews knew too. By 1942, the British air defense in the Mediterranean had increased significantly. New radars appeared on the ships. They detected low-flying planes earlier, giving more time to prepare for repelling the attack. Modern ship-based fighters appeared, the Sea Hurricane and the Martlet, which patrolled over the convoys and intercepted torpedo bombers before they reached the drop distance. The SM-79 responded to this with what it knew how: speed, maneuvers at low altitude, and tactics of simultaneous attacks from several directions. But the ratio of losses was changing, slowly, but changing. Every month of 1942 to 1943 was a little heavier than the previous one. Experienced crews who had gone through dozens of sorties were an irreplaceable resource. Training a new torpedo bomber pilot quickly is impossible. It takes months of training, special skills, a special cast of character. And machines and people were becoming fewer. And then came September 1943, the moment that changed everything, not only for the Hunchback, but for the whole country. Italy withdrew from the war, and the plane that had just been fighting on one side found itself in a completely new reality, split, contradictory, and unpredictable. September 8th, 1943, late evening. An official announcement is read on Italian radio. Italy has signed an armistice with the Allied powers, Great Britain, the United States, and their allies. For the country, this meant the end of one war and the immediate start of another. Internal, tangled, cruel. German troops who were in Italy acted quickly. Already in the first days after the announcement of the armistice, they occupied most of the country north of Naples. In the north, a puppet state was created under German control, the Italian Social Republic. The south of the country was occupied by British and American troops, advancing from the south from Sicily. Italy split in half, right through the living. For the Italian Air Force, this meant immediate chaos. Part of the units ended up in the north, under German control. Part in the south, under the Allies. Part scattered across neutral countries or was interned. Planes, bases, personnel, equipment, documents, everything mixed up in the first weeks after the armistice. On southern airfields that came under Allied control, they gradually collected what was left of the Italian aviation. Among the machines were SM-79s. 29 planes of this type ended up scattered across different airfields in the south of the country. Some of them were in flying condition, some required repair. Several machines needed major restoration. They were collected, inspected, began to be repaired. The decision on what to do with them was made quite quickly. There were no combat tasks for them, or rather, combat tasks in the usual sense. But there were more than enough transport tasks. The front line in Italy was slowly moving north, supplying Allied troops, transporting staff officers, communication between bases, delivering urgent cargo to places where ground transport did not reach quickly. All this required planes. Simple to maintain, reliable, capable of working from small field airfields. The SM-79 was not bad for this. Everything superfluous was removed from the machines. Shooting points, removed or mothballed. Bomb racks, dismantled. Inside, places for passengers or cargo fasteners were equipped. On the outside, new identification marks were applied. In December 1944, on the basis of these machines, the 3rd Transport Wing of the Italian Air Force was officially formed. Italian, but now working on the side of the Allies, performing tasks in the interests of the general campaign. The wing not only transported passengers and cargo, crews performed special tasks behind the front line, scattered leaflets over territories occupied by German troops, performed reconnaissance routes, ensured communication with partisan detachments in the north of the country. This was quiet, inconspicuous work, without records, without newspaper headlines, without pathos. Just a plane that flies where needed and does what is required. But parallel to this, the final chord of the combat career. In the north of the country, under German control, SM-79s also remained. And there, part of the machines continued to be used precisely as torpedo bombers, in the interests of the German command in the Mediterranean Sea. Italian crews serving in the Italian Social Republic continued sorties. The last documented combat sortie of an Italian SM-79 as a torpedo bomber took place in January 1945. January 1945. Until the end of combat operations in Europe, less than 4 months. At this time, jet planes were already flying in the sky. Germany was using the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first serial jet fighter. The speed, 850 kilometers per hour, almost twice as fast as the SM-79 at its best indicators. And the Hunchback was still flying, at low altitude over the Mediterranean Sea, with a torpedo under the fuselage, to where the ship stood, with the very same tactics that were worked out back in '41. It was majestic and a little sad at the same time. When in May 1945 combat operations in Europe ceased, there were 24 serviceable SM-79s in the 3rd Transport Wing in southern Italy. 24. Remember this number? That is exactly how many machines General Valle ordered in 1935. His very first order. 24 planes. Back then, these machines did not yet exist. They still had to be built. 10 years later, at the end of the most destructive war in European history, exactly 24 machines of this type are in service. Coincidence? Of course. But history sometimes loves such coincidences, as if the circle closed. It would seem now exactly the end. War is behind. The machines are outdated. There is no place for them in the post-war sky. But the Hunchback surprised yet again, because some of these planes continued to fly for a long time, much longer than anyone could have expected. May 1945, the war in Europe ended. For most combat aircraft, this moment meant one of two things: scrapping for metal or a museum. Machines built for war became unnecessary very quickly in peacetime. Airfields all over Europe were littered with planes that had nowhere to fly. The Hunchback took a different path. In Italy, the surviving SM-79s were handed over to a special service, with the long official name Corriere Aerei Militari, translated roughly as military airmail. It was engaged in the transport of government officials, urgent cargo, and official correspondence. There, the Hunchbacks flew alongside other machines, the three-engine transport SM-82s and American Martin Baltimore bombers, converted into a transport variant and received under lease-lend contracts during the war. Several machines ended up in flight schools. There, they taught young pilots to fly multi-engine planes, patiently, without pretension. A plane that once set world speed records now flew students on training routes over post-war Italy. Part of the machines were converted into target tugs, special structures on a cable that are pulled behind the plane so that anti-aircraft gunners can train in shooting. The work is inconspicuous and not at all heroic, but necessary. Since 1949, American Beechcraft C-45 training and transport planes began to gradually displace Hunchbacks from flight schools. By 1952, the SM-79 had completely disappeared from the Italian Air Force. 18 years since the prototype's first flight. This is a very long time for a combat plane of any era. But in Spain, the story continued. Those 61 planes that the Italian Expeditionary Corps handed over to the Spanish Air Force after the civil conflict in 1939 survived the entire Second World War. Spain officially maintained neutrality in this war, and no one shot down, captured, or bombed its planes. They just flew, year after year. When everything ended in Europe, Spanish Hunchbacks continued to serve. They were used for patrolling Spanish colonial territories in North Africa, Ifni and Rio de Oro, small coastal enclaves on the Atlantic coast of Africa, where there were no modern airfields, no developed infrastructure, and no need for the latest equipment. The Hunchback was enough there. The last Spanish SM-79s flew there until the beginning of the 60s of the 20th century. The 60s. At this time, jet passenger airliners were already flying in the sky. The Boeing 707 carried hundreds of passengers across the Atlantic in a few hours. And a wooden metal three-engine plane, designed for the London-Melbourne Race in 1934, continued to fly over the African coast. But the most unexpected post-war story of the Hunchback happened not in Spain and not in Italy. It happened in Lebanon. In 1949, in this Middle Eastern country, they were just beginning to form their own air force. Planes were needed. Inexpensive, simple to maintain, capable of performing basic tasks. Through the Italian trading firm Societe Khalil Sati, Lebanon purchased 4 SM-79s. They were assembled literally from spare parts. They took several machines that were in storage at an airfield in the Italian city of Frosinone, disassembled them, selected the best parts and components, brought them to a single standard, and assembled 4 fully serviceable planes. They installed Alfa Romeo 128 series engines. The characteristic hump and the sub-fuselage gondola remained in their places, but there was no armament on the machines anymore. In September to October 1949, these 4 planes flew to Lebanon. On their sides appeared the emblem of the Lebanese Air Force, a green cedar, the symbol of a country that had nothing to do with Italian air races in 1934, nor with Spain, nor with North Africa, nor with the battle for Malta. Just a plane that found work. Lebanese SM-79s flew until 1960. 11 years. Without records. Without combat sorties. They just flew. over the mountains of Lebanon, over the Mediterranean Sea, over Beirut. In 1966, the government of Lebanon decided to gift one of the remaining planes to Italy, a historical gesture. A plane of Italian production, Italian design, Italian engineering thought, was returning home. Today, this copy is kept in the Museum of Aviation History in Italy. It stands quietly, in a hall with other machines of its era. On the side, one can still see traces of the Lebanese emblem, a green cedar, almost erased by time. Look at it if you are nearby. This plane started as a racing prototype that lost its only race. It was turned into a bomber against an official competition by the personal decision of one general. It fought in Spain, in Africa, over the Mediterranean Sea. It set world records and flew at night over foreign cities. It was converted into a torpedo bomber, and it became the best in this role in the entire European theater of operations. It was written off several times, and each time it found a new task. It flew in 7 countries. For 26 years from the first to the last flight. In total, between 1,330 and 1,458 units were built. Data from different sources vary slightly. This is the most massive Italian multi-engine bomber in the history of the country. Not bad for a plane that started with a defeat. There is such a pattern in the history of technology. The best machines rarely turn out exactly as they were intended from the very beginning. They become themselves gradually, through mistakes, through conversions, through people who saw potential in them when others saw only limitations. General Valle saw a bomber in a racing prototype. Naval aviators saw a torpedo bomber in an aging bomber. Lebanese military saw a reliable training plane in a written-off machine. Every time, the Hunchback justified this trust. It was not the most beautiful plane of its time. Not the most technically perfect. Not the most protected. But it was real. Made of simple materials, by simple methods, for difficult tasks. And it managed. This is, probably, the main thing that can be said about the Savoia-Marchetti SM.79 Sparviero. The hunchbacked hawk of the Italian Royal Air Force. A plane that was not supposed to become a legend, but did. Thank you for watching. See you soon.